Mount Vernon. There's one up there, but it's only
Thank you. All right, good afternoon. I would like to call to order the August 19th, 2024 Lake Washington School Board Study Session. Let the record reflect that all school board members are present, and we also have all 4 of our student representatives this evening. So welcome to everyone. The one topic on our study session this evening is OE 10. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Dr. Holman.
Yeah, and so I'm going to quickly hand it over to Deputy Superintendent Gillingham and Associate Superintendent Dr. Jen Rose. Tonight really is about sharing information with the board. Last year, the board had an interest in learning more about a few components that are relative to the student experience in the schools. And so this is a revisiting of that, and we have a few other topics that we'll need to get to during the year as well. But tonight, assessing and grading are going to be primary, and so I'll hand it over to Matt.
All right. So tonight we are going to be digging into operational expectation 10, or at least part of that. And so here's briefly our agenda, and these are not in equal parts. So we'll just briefly, I'm going to touch on kind of a review of the policy and work today. And then we'll start into an overview of influential frameworks or paradigms. As the board knows, as we've gone to look at revising policies over the past few years, we've brought into this space with the board. Here are things that are already in the system, that frameworks, things that best practices, things that you should have some awareness of, because there's power in thinking about how the system is aligned. And so we'll just briefly touch on a few of those, more as just kind of for things for you to have in the back of your mind. We'll spend the bulk of, then I'll hand it over to Dr. Rose, who will spend the bulk of the time looking at one area of the student experience and kind of student environment, which is the impactful areas, the assessing and grading. The board has expressed an interest in exploring other areas of the student experience, so things about like restorative practices, discipline, attendance, restraint, and isolation. We're not going to dive into those tonight because assessing and grading takes a long time to really unpack it and to start to be thinking about this. And then really have kind of some essential questions for the board to think about. I will be sending the board an email with a form that we'd like you to complete that allows you to just kind of capture your thoughts as we're going. So as when I go to hand it off to Dr. Rose, I will send that out, and then you can pull that up in your email and look at that. So OE10, learning environment, treatment of students. This is our current policy, the board's current policy. I know you can't read that, but it's maintaining a learning environment safe, respectful, free of unnecessary disruptive, and conducive to effective learning. Expect the superintendent to maintain a collaborative school culture with high expectations, inclusive, equitable, welcoming, having policies and procedures related to discipline that are appropriately communicated, collaboratively developed, protecting student confidential information, not having volunteers that have unsupervised contact, not tolerating behaviors, permitting unruly behaviors, and thinking about the naming. The board's most recent update to this was 10.8 in providing a directive to the superintendent around the naming of buildings. So, last March, the board engaged with its student representatives to get their perspectives on the learning environment, and that was to kind of go into the extended study session to have to kind of spend some time having conversations. We did not get to have that conversation, and so we're actually kind of just picking that back up. The board meeting, we ended up spending some time on other items that took a little bit longer, so this got deferred. So as far as thinking about essential questions, is the board is thinking about its policy. The policy really should be expressing values to the organization and to the superintendent, who then interprets those and provides administrative direction to the organization. So as we kind of begin this process and going through tonight, doing more of a deeper dive around assessing and grading, but just really be thinking about the extent to which that the policy captures your values around the student experience and what the experiences that support student success, and ways in which that the policy may not. Okay, so I'm going to just highlight, as we were thinking through this, and similar to how we thought about R3, social emotional learning, thought about engagement with community stakeholders and OE9, I was thinking about, well, what is in the system, or what's within the educational sphere? What are the things that we think of that are essentially driving opportunities for the student environment, student experience? And so one is our draft student profile. And so I want to bring that in and share some places where it may have some connections here. Another is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which every teacher gets a primer in, and we often use to think about setting students up for success. Another related to restorative practices, which we won't do a deep dive in today, but is the social discipline window. And then the Danielson framework for teaching is actually our evaluation framework that we use with all of our teachers. And so that one's pretty important, just because it's the conversation, it's what's being used in our conversation between our principals and our educators. Jen will highlight the 6 principles for assessing and grading that we've been using to drive work around assessing and grading for the last few years. And then student growth goals are getting an overhaul this year by OSPI. And that also, you think about where are the conversations that our educators are having, and particularly Danielson and student growth goals is where kind of the things that are driving conversations or anchoring some of the conversations with our educators right now. So I'm going to go through, give a brief primer on at least the first 3, and then we'll hand it over to Dr. Rose for the last 3. So we have, and I'll admit this, we have drafted a student profile, a staff profile, and organizational profile through a bunch of committees over last year, and we have some work to do to start to socialize these, and so we can, put the finishing touches on them. But as we think about for the kind of the student environment, you think about these are the things that we're trying to, graduate from the school, Lake Washington School District. We hope to develop in the mindsets, perseverance, adaptability, agency, curiosity, and acceptance. And then there's 6 skill sets and practices related to those. And I think as we look at towards particularly kind of the assessing and grading part of it, we were having a conversation this morning thinking about, taking calculated risks. To what extent are we creating an environment where our students feel that they can take risks in their learning? Thinking about student kind of self-awareness and management, that agency piece is, to what extent do our students have experience an environment where they're able to articulate their own goals and aspirations, and their ability to demonstrate capability, resilience, and balance. So we think that this is, we really are kind of centering what we're wanting to develop in our students, should also then inform kind of how does that inform the environment that our students are experiencing. Another framework that is one that is well known by educators is thinking about the hierarchy of needs. And so what Maslow's hierarchy of needs kind of posits is that in order for us to develop as humans to a point where we're essentially able to kind of really thrive and succeed, and that self-actualization at the top there is that we have to it's built off of a foundation of different layers. So our physiological needs is essentially is like, are we fed and we sheltered, and kind of some of our basic physical needs taken care of? Are we safe? So thinking about the learning environment, is it a safe environment? Do we feel secure? We've spent a couple of years ago really looking in at love and belonging, and sense of belonging is a key indicator that we pay attention to, because you can see that we don't even start to get to kind of success, that self-actualization, if people don't feel like they are cared for, or they belong, that they belong. There's a saying, right, that is, I don't, and I'm going to butcher it right now, but essentially is that, I don't care what you have to teach me if I don't know that you care. And so these are things that as we think about, I did totally just butcher that, didn't I? Yeah. What is it really? What?
I don't remember what you said or did, but I'll remember how you made me feel.
Yeah, that's way more articulate than what I
still
said.
probably got it wrong.
Yeah, you did, but it was better than my. So really, when we think about the board's policy kind of speaks to some of these things right now, but this can be a framework that we can come back to as we evaluate that. And then when we think about restorative practices, when we think about culturally responsive teaching, they both use variations of what's called the social discipline window. And the way to think about this is there's two different dimensions. One is the dimension of support. So are we encouraging, nurturing? And then the other is kind of here it's referred to control, but it can also be referred to as expectations. So if we have high levels of kind of expectations or controls, but low levels of support, from a discipline standpoint, that's punitive. I expect you to do things, but I'm not going to show you or teach you or help you be able to meet those expectations. So I'm just going to punish you when you don't meet those expectations. So that would be where, practices of suspending students, but not having ever taught them what you actually expected behavior is. On the other end of that, we can love our kids to death and have, want to be really supportive of them, but very permissive, right? Very passive, like it's okay, we can accept that, students aren't turning things in, or, their behaviors, might be harmful to others, but that's okay. They're great kids. And so that you can get into this permissive quadrant, right? You actually have really low expectations. And when we think about culturally responsive teaching, the term's called kind of warm demanders, is you're blending this high expectations and high levels of support. And so restorative practices lean into that quadrant, which is that, no, there actually are really high expectations and such that you're going to have to address whatever sort of harm that your behavior may have caused. But you also have high level of support because you're connected to that classroom. You have relationships such that you want to actually repair that harm. And so this can be a really powerful window when we think about kind of some of the values of expectation and support and how they work together. Now I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Rose, who will go into the next three kind of areas of consideration.
So the Danielson Framework for Teaching, I think probably one of the most important things to know about it is it's how we define effective practice. So it hits all aspects of teaching, and it's research-based in looking at what's most effective for creating powerful classrooms, powerful learning in 4 different domains. An important thing to know about Danielson right now is that we are just about to switch for next year to the 2022 version of Danielson. We've been using the 2011 version for some years. And what's happened since 2011 and 2022 with the new version is massive change across the world and really across education. And so the framework has shifted to reflect what we now know and understand about teaching. And it shifted in some pretty dramatic ways, and especially in Domain 2 that I'll highlight a little bit later. But it's one of those things, Domain 2 is the learning environment. So as we're thinking about OE10, we really are leaning into Domain 2 in the learning environment with that. The next piece that's a subset of teacher evaluation that's a really important part, especially as we're thinking about assessing and grading our student growth goals. OSPI came up with some new student growth goals a couple years ago. They actually were born out of the pandemic, and they've been piloted across the state for the past couple of years. We piloted here last year, and this year, all districts across the state are required to implement the new student growth goals. And it's exciting because it really is, again, shifting the thinking and the research that the growth goals were based on, and thinking about how do we want students to understand and experience learning and having the growth goals align with that. So that's pretty exciting. We'll dive into that a little more. We also use in Lake Washington our 6 guiding principles for assessment and grading. And this came from stakeholder work during the pandemic to think about, again, all the research that's out there around assessing and grading. And they came out as guiding principles because the work around grading is really complex. So mandates are something that are fairly tricky. So the stakeholder group really wanted to think about what are the guiding principles, especially as we think about equitable outcomes for students. So these are something that students or teachers have engaged in learning over the past several years, and we'll talk a little bit more about how they came to be and how they're used. So this chunk of tonight, I wanted to really dive into assessing and grading, share the work to date, and talk a little bit about what separates them. But before we do that, as we're thinking about how grading and assessing lands with OE10, I'm going to ask you to individually think about on your K-12 experience. We'll leave college out. Well, you can bring college in if you want. But think on your K-12 experience and some experience you had that was really memorable related to grading or assessing. And just think for a moment what made it memorable. I'm going to ask you to turn and share with an elbow partner. Yep. And I will pull us back together. Can I ask, can you, we won't share out too much with the large group, but can you show me like 1 if it was well, let's do it this way. 5 if it was a really positive memory, 1 if it was a negative memory. Okay. Okay, this is why we're talking about OE10 related to grading. That when we're talking about assessing and grading, it's pretty deep and visceral, where we feel like we are absolutely being engaged and being judged in some way or compared in some way. And I shared with Dr. Holman that mine was 7th grade social studies. I shared a little bit with you that I transferred schools a lot, so I didn't attend very often. And I walked into my 7th grade social studies class, took a test on Tuesday. Friday, come to class, and the test has been graded, and Mr. Zimba, I remember super clearly, says, "Welp, you all would have passed or gotten C's, but Jenny got 100%, so you're all like C minus D." And I remember that moment of like, I'm horrified, and I have no friends, and I'm being compared on something that was like, I loved the book. It wasn't hard for me. It wasn't like it was actual learning. Something just got all messed up in this equation around grading and learning. So that was mine. And the other memory that comes from me being a teacher was a student saying to me after my 3rd or 4th year teaching, I graded a whole set of essays, and the student came back. I saw him in the parking lot, and he said, "Oh, Miss Rose, you gave me a C. I thought you liked me." And that struck me also as like, wow, he thinks that me liking or not liking him has something to do with the grade. And it made me wonder, like, does it? Like, how am I assessing my students and thinking about how grading comes into play? So I wanted to pull that in when we're thinking about student growth and grading and assessing in OE10. OE 10.2 says ensure an inclusive, equitable, welcoming, and safe school environment. And I'll let you read some of the superintendent indicators there. The bottom indicator, welcoming and safe, I think all of them apply to assessing and grading, but that one really, like when you think about how students feel about grading and their experience of grading, welcoming and safe where they feel physically, emotionally, socially, and academically secure with a strong sense of belonging directly ties to thinking about assessing and grading. And it applies to thinking about student growth in Danielson. If you click on the link later and look at OSPI's general guidance for student growth, the foundational principles for student growth directly align with thinking about how students feel and experience and feel empowered and own their learning. And I wanted to pull back in the student profile again, just to think about if these are our goals for students, if this is the learning that we hold to be most important, then how does that show up in the classroom? What is that learning experience? What are the curricular pieces of it? But if you think about how we're assessing students or how they're assessing themselves and what grades reflect, these are complex pieces to reflect. It's relatively easy to say if we'd said, and no standards say this anymore, if we'd said memorize a collection of dates, memorize a collection of equations, then we can give an A, B, or C for that. But those aren't part of our skill sets or our practices. And those aren't that type of memorization. That history test I took in 7th grade, that's not the learning that's future ready for students. Doesn't mean that there aren't places for it, but when we're really thinking about what we value, the core of evaluation is what we value. So when we're thinking about assessing and grading, we should be really thinking about what we value, which comes back to skill sets and practices. So I wanted just to have a couple slides to think about the purpose of assessment and of grading, because they're related, but they're different. And we frequently, I think, as educators or in our educational system, put them together when they're actually separate things. So assessment really is thinking about how are we as educators and how are students understanding and guiding their progress and any instructional decisions with that. It really is about, assessment really should be about empowering students to take ownership of their learning. And by ownership, it's not thinking about just what grade they get, but how is what they're learning matter to them? How do they see it have value? How do they adjust it? How do they think how it personalizes for them? Assessment really is thinking about evaluating and improving teaching practices. And I remember that as a teacher, just assessing constantly to think, how did this work? Did someone actually learn something? How do I need to adjust? What do I do next? And then thinking about continuous growth for educators and for teachers. The purpose of grading, So assessment is something that is a constant. It's part of the ethos of a classroom. Grading is more of a subset of that. So grading should be reflecting student mastery of learning objectives as well as the effectiveness of educational strategies. Grading also is a really important way that the school, the teacher is communicating to parents and to students, here's where the student is on the learning progression, on the learning standards. That it does encourage student accountability and ownership. This, I think other ways I've seen this put is motivation. And I like accountability and ownership much better, because that's motivation can be, I want a certain percentage or I want a certain grade, whereas the actual deeper purpose of grading should be accountability and ownership of learning to purpose. And that grading should be something that's a natural outcome of high quality instruction, not something that's a mystery, not something that happens at the very end, and that students should have a deep sense of where they are with grading as well. And all of it should be aligned to clear, consistent standards and learning targets that are known to both students and teachers. So they're related, they're subsets, but they're related. So when we think about the mindset shift of future-ready assessing and grading, and I want to also be really clear, this is happening in many, many, many places in our schools, that we are really well on our way to thinking about learning and using assessment in a way that really supports student ownership of learning. But systemically, we're thinking about moving from grading for comparison to grading for growth, from content coverage or course coverage or unit coverage to deep understanding in a way that is able to transfer, not just I passed this course, therefore I move to this next one. But when we think about what we mean by future ready, it's being able to apply information, skills, knowledge in wildly different contexts. That once students are in college or once they're on their own, they're rarely going to be given a set of tasks to work through that don't require taking the skill sets from multiple different places and applying them. And that assessments are not just endpoints, but they're learning tools. And that with that, I actually debated using mistakes as failures, or using the word mistakes, because if we're going to try anything new, we're going to not have it work out the first time. And maybe we call it a mistake, or maybe it's a learning opportunity. But really leaning into thinking about, we have to be able to take risks as learners so that we can learn. If you don't take any risks, then you don't learn. And moving from extrinsic motivation to intrinsic motivation. So these are the shifts that we're working to make in our system, and they're ones that I'd say that we're well on our way in many places. Couple notes, and I won't read all of this to you, but just a couple notes on, I guess we'd say, current state. Or traditional models, that some traditional models had behaviors be part of the grade. How often students were tardy, did they pay attention in the way that the teacher thought was appropriate, that it was thought of as more, that traditional models are often competitive with others, and that students are competing for rank. And what we hear, and this comes up in the data in OE, in R3, when we think about things like self-efficacy of students, or we think about their sense of belonging or their connection to others, these are some of the things that traditional models of grading really work against. So what we want to move towards is having students be competitive with self. And what we mean by that is the absolute best that they can be in a way that's satisfying and relevant to them. That they have a deeper understanding and ownership of their learning, so that when they're in a course, they're able to, or in a learning situation, they're able to make sense of it and have it be something that matters to them. So these can be, anytime there's bullet points, there's massive amounts of systems behind them and considerations behind them. So some of the things that we think about in the shifts that have happened or are happening in schools, like teachers are very committed. Many teachers are very committed to giving students multiple opportunities to retake an assessment or to get additional help. An issue with that sometimes can be our 7-period day and transportation, and how students can actually access teachers, or teachers have resources to be able to provide different opportunities. That absolute key is developing self-efficacy with students, where the curriculum design, the instructional design is realistic, relevant work plans. Another thing to always keep in mind is there are always unintended consequences. Like I think some of our high school principals will talk about the impacts of the N grade, and thinking about how, and we'll talk about that briefly, but thinking about in any type of change, there's always unexpected things that happen, and how do you manage that in a way that keeps true to your vision of learning for students. And when we think about things like being on time to class, that's important. Being on time to your job is important. Having productive collaborative behaviors, really important. But they're not part of a learning standard. So as we think about how do we have parameters for our schools to keep important aspects of the overall school experience and have assessment and grading be something that does stand up. A few notes on thinking about the very diverse, the considerations for grading, especially at secondary. So when you think about everything from physical education to AP physics to world history to culinary arts, there are so many different subject areas that teachers need to be really and are really thoughtful about how they assess in those different subject areas, which makes it which makes a one-size-fits-all grading policy something that's a little bit problematic, that we really want to think about what are the teachers' professional judgment, what's the knowledge that they need, what are the decision points that they need in order to really think about how does learning best happen in their classroom and how does assessment and grading support that. Students have really diverse needs, which means that we are constantly thinking about universal design for learning and how students with diverse needs and abilities can reflect their learning achievements. There's all different kinds of assessment types. We are constantly thinking about how grading practices are fair, unbiased, and reflective of student learning. Another piece that we have a strong interest in as a system is thinking about calibration across classrooms, that we one size fits all might not be something that we want, but we definitely want calibration across classrooms. That if you are, there should be some guiding practices, there should be some things that in a classroom, in an English classroom in a school, you'll have a common experience. And we really want to think about feedback and communication. How does assessment and grading really engage students and parents in learning? And last point on this is thinking about how grades influence student engagement and motivation, and their self-esteem, which relates to OE10, and thinking about how we do that in a way that is deeply affirming for students. So that's kind of the set of how we think about grading, and I'll give it just a couple slides on where we are currently with grading. So in COVID in 2020 and then in 2021, we did a lot of work with the stakeholder committee and with our parents and students to understand how people thought about assessing and grading, and in that really unique time, what made most sense. And it was interesting because what we uncovered was something that's probably not a surprise to anyone in this room. The practices that we had were really clearly not aligned with equitable outcomes for kids. And COVID made that clear. COVID didn't create that. COVID made it worse, but it made it really clear. So we became really aware of widespread inequities in a way that we had to keep looking at it and thinking about it. One of the things that happened for anyone who's a parent in, I think it would have been spring of 2020, was we sent out a survey to parents and students and asked them about assessing and grading. And the feedback we got was phenomenal. That student feedback was wonderful and spot on for saying, don't make life easier for us. That's not our goal. Our goal isn't that life is easier. Our goal is that our learning is respected and it's asked for in ways that we can show it. And we have a way that we can talk with our teachers about assessing and grading. Parents said the same thing. And we got, I'm trying to remember how many hundreds and hundreds thousands of responses we got, but the comments from students were consistently, please help assessing and grading deepen our learning, not make it something that's easy. Understandable, transferable, but not necessarily easy. So teachers were right there with our students and our parents, and so there was such a strong desire in our schools to go back in, even post-COVID, to go back in and start to think about assessing and grading. So many, many schools had book studies, departments had book studies on equitable grading, engaged in professional learning around there. And I know the board has heard and seen lots of little places where the new practices and the new way of thinking were tried out. And like anything that you do new, you're trying it out, and we're continuing to get better at mastering things. So that was really, especially that first year after COVID, that was teachers really being passionate and thinking, how do we adopt equitable assessing practices? So that's where the six guiding principles really came into play, that teachers were thinking about how do we put this into play? And it was really happening in schools, departments, and bright spots across the system. And there were a lot of them. And so as we moved from 2020, 21, 22, we as a system started really thinking about our inclusionary practices, as well as assessing and grading. And so we provided professional learning for 2 years, really focused on, to all teachers, focused on universal design for learning, to the point where all secondary teachers had a half day with Katie Novak and experts from her company on universal design for learning specific to assessing and grading. We had, again, additional book studies. We had lots of places where teachers were collaborating. We ran a secondary, essentially a conference for teachers, where teachers were sharing with each other how they did standards-based grading, how they did student-informed practices, how they really were leaning into what does the research tell us is important about assessing and grading. We continue to deepen that work in the instructional playbook, which has a universal design for learning embedded within it. Our PLC guidance for last year and going into this year use what's called teacher professional work time to deepen their practice and really think about assessing and grading along with other parts of teaching and learning. And we're continuing to expand the use of standards-based grading and equitable practices. And again, that's resulting in a variety of impacts across the system. So I think that the image I have in my head is kind of this wave where little bits of water go ahead, and then they retreat a little bit, then they go forward again. So our thought as a system is how do we take these bright spots in expanding practice and really lean into it? We made a couple of policy and procedure changes over the past 2 years to really think about how we're codifying equitable practice. And so one is our district does not give Fs anymore. Our district gives Ns because we believe that if a student didn't do well enough in the course to get credit, then they shouldn't get credit, but they shouldn't have the double whammy of having their GPA dramatically affected. So it's something that we really leaned into. What are our core beliefs about students, and how is that reflected in our procedures? We did some additional work in trying to align our other parts of procedure and practice, for example, the transcript translation alignment, where we thought, again, what do we really believe about students and grading? And we believe that our students should have their learning recognized wherever they're coming from. And so we did some work around transcript and translation alignment. Another place that we have a shared goal with LWEA showed up in our new certificate bargaining agreement last year. And it's new language around grading. And I'll let you read the paragraph there. And what comes through in this language is a shared desire to have consistent practice, consistent resources, not identical practice, but consistent practice where we are able to say as a system, these are the practices that we think are really important, and we will continue to lean into them. We'll continue to identify and lean into them. So that's a little bit of how we got to where we are. I wanted to give us some time to dive into the student growth goals. And the reason for that is that it will really, you'll see, we're interested in what your perceptions are, what your thoughts are on the actual language, how it aligns with OE10, and how it fits with thinking about assessing and grading. So, but let me pause there and see if there's questions or comments thus far.
I know one area of concern, and I think this is tying in with what you were just talking about of coming out of COVID, but I know I've heard from a lot of high school parents especially about really the balance between in terms of the final grade, in terms of how much homework counts in and other activities versus testing. Can you speak a little bit to that? Because I know there's been a lot of concern in the parent community, especially when there's a shift to tests. At least the perception is that tests are counting for 90% of the grade or thereabouts.
Right.
And the challenge is, especially thinking about universal design for learning, and if students don't test well, have you seen that, or what's the district's perspective on that, and how can those concerns be addressed?
Right. I think that's a great question. I think we are. It's one of those that it would be like to say generally, here's what we would do. There are more specific questions than that, more specific situations than that. So I wouldn't, from where I sit today, say there should or shouldn't be 90% of the grade is testing, or there should or shouldn't be this amount of homework in it. Where we are grounding our work as a system is in the professional learning of teachers in a way that's really concrete. And in helping our entire system understand what effective assessment looks like and how that might be reflected in grades. So it's a great question, but let me come back to it after we dive into student growth goals. So what you have in front of you are the new student growth goals. But before we dive into that, I know this is small. Oh, yeah, oh, sorry.
Sorry, I have one more question
go
before we
for
get
it.
to that really quickly. And I'm going back to, I think it's the calibration piece that I'm trying to look at. Sorry. Okay, here. Calibration across classrooms and then comparing that to the CBA language. And when I read that CBA language, I'm curious, I'm trying to get to my notes here. Is it kind of saying as long as grading is consistent in a building, then that's kind of what we're looking at? Like, that's great, it's consistent in the building. But does that say then, like, grading practices adopted by, let's say, like Tesla STEM and Redmond High School can then look very drastically different, yet that is the same information we're receiving as far as how students are doing?
That can be true at this moment in time. Our interest as we're moving forward, especially once we're grounding, the bulk of our professional learning this year with our teachers is on student growth goals, and you'll see that it's mostly about assessing. So as we build on teacher learning and professional judgment, then we as a system will also come up with more consistent guidelines. So right now there could be very different practice, and our goal is to align the professional learning and then be able to align the policies and the procedures with that. Yeah. Okay. All right. So if you're looking online, I know this is small, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but when you're looking at domain 2, so this is going back to the new Danielson, and this will be something that we implement next year. It's right now we have it as a resource that we can look at, but we won't implement till it becomes part of the state required evaluation system for next year. But you can really see, in looking especially at 2A and 2B, you can really see really the goal for what we want classrooms to feel like. And I wanted to put that up there because as we all, are raising our fingers of mostly 1 for our experiences in assessing and grading, this is really key for us to lean into. How do students feel in the classroom, and what are ways that we can actually define and support positive classrooms, and thinking about OE10. So I'll ask you to hold that in your brain. And then you have student growth goal rubrics. I'm actually going to give us about 10 minutes to dive into looking at this. There's pens and highlighters and boxes around if you want to grab anything to write with. And I'm going to ask you to dive in and think about, put a star next to anything that seems like an important idea, an exclamation point that's something that surprises you, and a question where you have a wondering. And I'll check back in about 7 minutes and see where we are. important ideas, what was new or surprised you, what wonderings or questions you have, and what rises to the top for you. And I'll pull us back together in about 1 minute. And I will pull us back together unless you want more time for partner discussion. Okay. So I'm hearing some great questions and thoughts come up. So this is just open time for other questions, thoughts, comments from the board or student representatives. What came up for you as you were reading through the student growth goals? Yeah.
I was looking at the student growth 3.1, and I realized that one of the things it said was that teachers should be able to monitor the progress of each and every student in this identified group. And I don't know if that's more feasible just at elementary level where there's 30 students, but especially at a larger secondary level where teachers have 30 students, 6 or 7 classes a day, that's almost 200 students. I think it's just not feasible for teachers, or to expect teachers to be able to monitor the progress of each and every student, as well as if they are at a secondary level. I think it's more important that even if students are less proficient in a subject, that they're able to monitor their own progress and know what they need to learn, and that the motivation comes from within them. Because that's setting them up for more success than if your teacher is always monitoring your progress and holding your hand and making sure you do well in everything, but then you go on to college or whatever future path and you don't know how to study yourself. So I don't know if like asking teachers to monitor progress of each and every student is the best wording, or if as a team we figure out how to best support that student is better.
Oh, there we go. So you're asking some great questions.
Well, great questions, and what's so interesting is if we had the framework for teaching alongside of it, a distinguished teacher actually does lead to students understanding and assessing themselves. And so what you're saying is exactly what the framework for teaching asks teachers to do. This is also how are the teachers' practices kind of coming alongside of that as well, because you need both in the classroom. So great point.
Well, and one of the evolutions of student growth goals and of the Danielson framework was it used to say, the old framework would say something like, to be a proficient teacher, essentially most students needed to be mostly successful. And when we say that, we're leaving out historically marginalized students over and over and over again. So the framework actually was informed, or the changes to the framework were informed by a lot of research from OSPI, specifically thinking about this work from Adeyemi Stembridge, and thinking about when we say most students most of the time, we do not meet our goals in terms of equitable outcomes for all kids. And so absolutely it's incredibly hard to say all students will be, a teacher will know where all students are in their learning. And it really does, your point is well taken, it really does need to be done in partnership with the students, because assessment shouldn't be something that's done unto students, it should be with students so that they're empowered in their learning. And a part that, I don't know if it'll come up in discussion, but I think for me, one of the most interesting pieces of the new student growth goals are the goal requires students' cognitive and emotional engagement. That students need to be mentally engaged in the work and it needs to be relevant to them. Emotional engagement means they care about it. And so that really goes to thinking about how learning is designed and what resources, what ways the students experience the learning. Because again, like a really important part of this is that the student has to be asked how they experience the learning and have that be part of what a teacher thinks about when they're planning, which is what teachers do anyway. So.
Actually, I think this goes back to Lisa's point earlier. We've got two groups we're looking at, students and teachers, and we're leaving out parents. And that has a major impact on the students' desires, their self-assessment. It's if the student and the teacher understand these rubrics, but the parent has no clue, then they're still looking for some other measurement. And I think there needs to be a method for parents to learn how this is being done. And I don't, to be quite frank, know how you can send parents back to school to learn this new rubric, to be quite frank. I mean, the old standard of A through F, people understood. And you're going to take tests and your homework is going to be graded. I remember years ago when all of a sudden homework wasn't being graded and parents were freaking. And I could understand that because you didn't know where your child really was, what had penetrated the skull, what hadn't. And it seemed like for the students, for certain things, you needed to be able to say, okay, gee, I got a good grade, so I think I learned that. You need to be able to have that self-assurance. The parents need to be able to say, oh, Susie got a C? Well, maybe there's something needs to be helped along the way. Something's missing. Either she wasn't getting it, the teacher wasn't conveying it, or a combination. And parents, if the parents have a desire to know what their student is learning, and if they can't understand then they put perhaps they will then end up putting the emphasis on the wrong thing for the student and putting more pressure on the student, I think. I could be wrong.
You are bringing up some great points that are of interest to OSPI and to, of course, Lake Washington School District. In the rubric, in order to, it calls out specifically that a teacher seeks and considers, when provided, input from students' families in developing the goal for student learning. That's also part of the new Danielson, and one of the evaluative criterion for the state is communicating with families. So all of these pieces nest together, but absolutely having families be part of the conversation is something that is a stronger and stronger interest. Like, as you see the focus in here on educators understanding the students really well, that's understanding their families as well. So there's a strong interest in that.
What we don't have, though, is a framework. You basically have the students, or the parents and the teacher having one meeting at the very first of the year. Perhaps then, certain conferences, but not ongoing.
Yeah.
And I don't know how you set that up, to be quite frank, given the nature of society.
Those are definitely things that I think are getting stronger, our ability to do that. I think the parents' desire for that has always been really strong, and I think our ability to communicate as a system and as individual teachers gets stronger. This year, as we're implementing the new student growth goals, that's a part of it that we'll be working to think about how we do that really thoughtfully. So, yes.
You know, one of the reasons we're adopting a learning management system, readopting a learning management system, is kind of exactly to your point. As a parent with a student in 6 classes last year, there were 6 different methods of attempting to communicate that. Some of them were successful for my family and me, and others were more difficult. But I can tell you the teachers, all of them, had a method of communicating kind of what's coming up, the expectations, what's occurring in the classroom. Here's the intended outcomes that we're seeking. Here's the learning objectives. So for me, I feel like over time, teachers have been getting more and more kind of astute around communicating that with families. And I think that LMS will provide a single kind of landing place where that is communicated consistently across all of our classrooms. So, but it's an essential component, because without it, it is really difficult.
Lindsay, did you have something?
I spent most of my time more focused on the critical attributes of student growth. I really like the student engagement and assessment. I don't know how often that is used in classrooms, but I really appreciate all those bullet points, and then also that feedback from students on their experiences. I think it's important that students see their teachers as learners as well, and that providing feedback is helping them grow in their practice as well. So I really appreciate this.
So we did, the student growth goals are the large focus of our professional learning with teachers this year. Probably about 1/3 of our available hours for professional learning are dedicated to student growth. And we kicked that off during our district leadership week by inviting teacher leaders in for 2 days to lead with their building principal. And we had, depending on the side of the school, we had more than one teacher come in. But we felt it was really important to have that partnership and to be focused in on, these are some pretty deep things to be thinking about that our educators are, our building leaders and our teachers are thinking about them. But how do we do this going forward in a systemic way that's really impactful? So we're already several days into professional learning, and that'll be the focus. Those teachers will be supporting our building leaders during August Leap for deeper learning, and then throughout the year.
Lisa?
We had a question that we were talking about around student growth criterion 3, and it where it talks about specifically attending to a smaller group of individual students. Actually, 2 questions that came out of that. Are all students eventually covered by one of those groups over the course of the year? Sort of how does that work? And also the language of who are not, students who are not yet reaching full learning potential. A lot of times we talk about standards and students who are at standard or above standard or below standard. I interpreted not yet reaching full learning potential, you could be above standard and still not reaching your full learning potential. Is that true, or am I just maybe reading into things there?
So the purpose of student growth goals, and it's a change from what it used to be. Like student growth goals used to be something like, it could be over the year, and that's frequently how teachers did it, is they would, use some measure of student learning, reading or something like that in the fall, and then they would look at it again in the spring. I don't know how typical that was, but it's kind of the conception of like you did student growth goals and it could be over the year with a small group and with a whole class. The goal of this model is that it's capturing practice that teachers are doing continually. So if I'm a high school teacher, I might have 6 students in my 3rd period class I'm really thinking about, and then maybe it's my 5th period class I'm really thinking about. So 3.1 might be a couple of students in 3rd period, 6.1 could be my 5th period class. So I, as an individual student, might not be part of that focus group, essentially, or that one class, but the goal is that the practices are something that the teacher is using throughout. And that the student growth goals are actually meant to be more of a natural harvest, like not a one-time thing that you do or a chart that you fill out, but really thinking about how do these practices show up continually, which is, again, that interplay with the Danielson framework. So, and then to your other point, yes, the student growth goals don't say specifically what we mean by meeting ultimate potential, but that's something that we've been thinking about as like students. We have many students that meet standard, and we are continuing to think about cognitive and emotional engagement for them.
Thank you, ma'am. So I guess this is a wonder. So I appreciate the title of this is that it's focused on, it's a methodology focused on growth. But as I was parsing through it, I was sort of wondering, like how much actually growth was embedded in it. What? Okay. How much growth was actually embedded in the practices? And let me figure out how I can get it this way. So there's still a summative assessment component of this. And when I think of summative assessment, I think of, am I hitting the rubric levels that are expected of me? Not where did I come from to where I am today. And so when I was parsing through this, I'm just trying to figure out, well, how much is this really, is the practice a growth practice of evaluation? For example, in English Lit, I started out as I'm a really terrible writer. And by the end of the year, I hit standard. I'm at standard, right? Well, maybe that growth, my growth over the course of the year, and if I think about how my learning, that may be A-level growth, right? But if we think about like the traditional practices, when I can't figure out when I'm looking at this, how much of that is still in here. I may not be what we would traditionally think of as an A-level writer, right?
Right.
And so that's what I couldn't quite parse out of this, is how much of a shift is this model?
So this would be much smaller. So that might have been something that old student growth might be like, you went from being a decent writer or an okay writer to being a really good writer. That's such a huge thing to say, like you can't really parse that down. So what we might say instead now is, okay, something that will really change your writing is use of feedback and revision. So in this one unit, we're going to focus in on your practices to revise your work and see if you get better at that, using a rubric, using standards that we would go through there. So it wouldn't be looking at where did you grow from October to April. It calls out specifically, you're looking at student growth within a unit with the thought that these practices are something that are becoming more standard or standard practice for teachers, and thinking about how their students are growing each unit. And I say that like I'm reflecting back on when I was a principal, student growth goals, the PE department might have student growth goals that were like, this group of students they're running the mile at this speed, and then they'll run the mile at this speed 6 months later. There's so much that goes into what happens with the student that's not really looking at what happens with the teacher's instruction or the student's ownership of it. It's fairly general. So if we're actually thinking about giving feedback to students or having teachers reflect on what changes their practice, it has to be more specific and narrow. I don't know if that makes sense. So
student growth goals really are part of a whole,
yes,
as opposed to the whole.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, then I'll offer my critique of this, is that I don't think it goes far enough. and having a growth mindset in terms of thinking about
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
So, if we're thinking about, we want our students to take risks and to challenge. I mean, a component of that is, particularly once you get a secondary education, is class selection. And if I'm going to choose the classes where I know I'm more likely to be traditionally successful, which I do still think is a big component of this. I'm not going to take those same level of risks, and I'm not going to have the same level of learning. So.
Yeah, I think we're excited about the implementation and wanted to bring it up because the student growth goals bring in a lot of what we really believe is important about culturally responsive education. So it is, like Dr. Holman said, it's nesting within pieces. And OSPI says the same thing, that teacher evaluation, the student growth goals sit within teacher evaluation, sit within the pedagogy of effective teaching and learning. So I'm focusing in on this piece because we're looking at it this year as a pretty powerful agent of change and alignment. We haven't had this type of focused learning around assessing and the pedagogy behind that. And as it relates to culturally responsive teaching, I don't know when that would last have happened.
And I think we're conflating grading practices with, this is teacher evaluation, and they're connected, but they're not the same thing. This is part of that bigger whole. So these rubrics aren't intended around student performance necessarily. They're intended around how can I as a principal engage my teacher in conversation around the practices that I'm seeing in the classroom relative to students setting goals and growing. Because in your example, I'm your teacher, and I may have brought you from way far away from standard to nearly or right at, and that's incredible growth over the course of a year, whereas Lindsay was already a high performer and really is still a high performer. You know what I mean? So the growth of Lindsay's going to look different than your growth perhaps, although there's something to be said of how am I pushing Lindsay's performance, to your point, to greater levels based on where she starts from too. So that's the piece I've heard a couple of times. We're conflating grading practice with teacher performance, and Jen's just trying to say we've got some opportunity here with a new focus, not just on the end, but on the process in between.
I almost feel like it's a misnomer. It should be teaching growth
Yeah.
goals
Yeah.
instead of student
I'll
goals.
I don't know that we'll have time to talk about this, but I'll hand out the student growth goals promoting reflective conversations sentence stems, because it really goes to what you just said, that it's really thinking about the conversation. And if you look at the bottom of it, there's a lot of interesting things on here. This is an example of the two of the student growth goals and questions that a teacher and a building leader could have around, or teachers could have around instruction. But I just wanted to highlight that box at the bottom that says, note, the purpose of these prompts is to promote and support interactive two-way conversations to probe practice and prompt reflection. It's really meant to be that focus in on teacher professional judgment, teacher learning, and with the belief that that is what supports effective practice with teachers, and with this specific to assessing. So.
One of the comments that was made as we were starting to discuss this over here was I'll use the word jargon, but that seems a little bit pejorative, but it was almost as if you're looking at something written in education ease as opposed to English. And what I'm trying to think of is when you present this to parents, though, they're not going to have a translator sitting at the table or sitting at home with them. And while this is great from teaching the teacher how to teach, conveying it then to the parents is going to have to be a different language, if you will, because unless they are a teacher themselves or come from a family of teachers, they're going to be clueless. And my concern is that in a vacuum of not understanding, putting either greater pressure or too little pressure, I don't know, but usually in this district it's too much pressure on the student because they don't understand the steps in the ladder. So I would encourage us to try and translate, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
into parent ease.
The ideal would be that the teacher and the parent interact in a way around the course content and their student. That I don't know that they would need to see the student growth goals that the teacher's being evaluated with, but that their actual experience of the learning is really important and called out in the
Well,
growth
I guess
goals.
what I'm saying is, as we roll this out to families and to teach them, what's going on with their student, we need to be mindful of that.
Yeah.
Because if we refer back to some of these other issues, then the parents really, there's going to be a disconnect.
Mhm.
I'm concerned there'll be a disconnect.
Thank you. So as we're thinking about, I just wanted to call us back to thinking about the student profile again and thinking about where that shows up in student growth and thinking about assessing. But I also want to pause and invite students, if you have comments or thoughts, before we move on to another set of general discussion.
I will say this, this version of student growth goals, if I was to put my principal hat on, is the exact kind of conversation that I would want to have with a teacher in reflecting on their professional practice. And so to me, they may not be perfect, but it definitely moves the needle on prompting supervisors and teachers to have professional conversations.
Well, students, feel free to jump in anytime, of course. So next steps as we're thinking about assessing and grading, this year we're implementing student growth goals. Next year we've got the new Danielson instructional framework. That, again, is a really, I think, powerful shift in aligning with the way thinking in education has changed in the last decade. I think that's pretty exciting. We continue to embed strategies and instructional resources, curriculum implementation, and all parts of professional learning. And not just student growth, but really student growth goals, but thinking about how are those principles that are deep in student growth something that show up in terms of how we're thinking about instruction. More and more deeply, how do students own their learning? How are they seeing it to be relevant and something they can transfer and something that's meaningful to them? We'll continue to provide resources. And a next step for us is to develop that more specific guidance on consistent use of equitable assessing and grading practices. So the goal is to have stakeholder engagement to be able to make a next step towards being clear about that across our system. So again, we're thinking about going from to. So I have those pieces up there just to think about. And I'll say from traditional grading, I know that there are many different things happening in our district. I also think it's really hard to change something that's so deeply embedded. Like I think about my experience. I went through 13 years of K-12. I went through college multiple times. I taught for years in a system that was very traditional grading. And I remember when I was first teaching, I think it was my second or third year, and most of my students had A's or B's, and I remember thinking I was going to get in trouble because wasn't it supposed to be like the bell curve? And I didn't mention to anybody because I thought for sure we were all supposed to teach on the bell curve. And that's a powerful culture. That's what many of us grew up in. And so as we think about OE10 and what helps our students feel like these mindsets are being developed, these skill sets and practices are something that are experience that they're having in classrooms so they graduate and go on to use them in whatever setting they want, that's fairly complex work. So with that, any questions, any thoughts, any other further discussion?
Dr. Yoko? Oh,
Sorry.
Jason.
Apologies. Could you go back to?
I'm so sorry,
Could you
James.
go back to where you transitioning from I forgot which slide it is. Yeah, I just want to comment on the first one where from grading for comparison to grading for growth, and it kind of ties back into Eric's comment earlier, where is this going to affect the overall grade that we get at the end as students? Are we gonna be graded on our growth, or is it still gonna be a objective scale of what we get?
Mm-hmm. There's not a set answer to that right now, because it's depending on the class that you're in and the content of that class. And I'm hesitating because I'm trying to think about what would be an accurate statement to make, and what would be the ideal that we would have. And I feel like I don't have a clear statement of saying you would always be graded this way, or this plus this always equals your final grade. I think we've had a lot of comments tonight about someone who may have made great growth. And it's interesting, you were looking at that slide earlier that I didn't make time for us to look at, and thinking about the differences in student achievement and then what the grade would reflect about that. So I think we were even just having this side conversation, and I'll pass this around so people can look at it, that the grades for these students tell such different stories. And so we as individual teachers have ways that grades are capturing that story, and we as a system are working towards calibration and alignment with our core values as a system. So I don't have a clear answer for you yet, because we're working through what would that look like in a way that supports equitable outcomes for kids.
Dr. Rose, I guess my framework is really in relation to standards.
Mm-hmm.
And while we are measuring growth and focusing on growth, don't the standards set the expectation for success in
Mhm.
core content?
Absolutely. Yeah, standards are the core of what students need to master. Yes, and the standards are really interesting because they do get at deep thinking. So many of them, when you think about how to assess those accurately, we traditionally, as a educational field, has had a default of going back to what the test tells us. And that's where we're really leaning into what are multiple assessments, multiple ways that students can express their learning, and universal design for learning to really understand if a student has met the standard.
Shira. I know you kind of talked about it earlier, but I think that the transition, or kind of like the application to students, isn't going to be as easy as like it is for teachers. And teachers, you know, can kind of act in a certain way, and as the role model, like, oh, these are like the new standards, or like the new, you know, processes that we may be like learning, and I want to use them to guide us. But I think the culture that specifically our district has, or even just in my school, it's going to be really hard to translate that to students. And like, I might even be like that example of like the student that will not like participate, just because like I've been so ingrained like in a certain way, like from the start, that what is the effect truly going to be, because there's going to be students that don't participate in it.
I think that's a great point. You make me think about just my comment earlier about how many years we as a system have spent in this, and you as a student have grown up in this ethos of what grading feels like and what your role in it is and what's rewarded or not in terms of actions and behavior. So you're right. I mean, that's a really, speaking as someone who has been in education for almost 30 years, that question that comes up so often, like what will be on the test, or how will it be graded, or some external value for learning, is something that has lots of reasons behind it. And so as we're thinking about how to make that shift, is going to be really important.
And I guess another thing is like we may be changing, but like the overall system isn't. So, you know, sometimes as students, like especially like secondary high schoolers, like we have to stick to the system, even if like around the people around us are changing, you know.
So I'm going to just offer up an example of, I think, the power, and coming back to power of policy, is those, so I'm going to reject that notion, because I mean, in some ways, then there's nothing we can do, right? We're all on this treadmill, and that's Shira. I say that not to say that it's, I think you are exactly right, that we are all part of a system, and that is, makes it very difficult to have change. But one of the power that the board has is being really clear in your values. And being clear in your values also then allows everybody else in the organization to express those. So I was really clear when I was in the classroom that I didn't give bonus points to students. I gave imaginary bonus points, and you were responsible for keeping track of those yourselves. But kids would always come in, they'd want to fix their grade, what, like, can I get any sort of bonus points? And I'd have the whole class, because it'd be a broken record, but the students are like, why don't I give out bonus points, right? Because that's not a true reflection of your learning, Mr. Gillingham, right? Like, but I was really clear with the students around that, because part of the value is their grades should reflect what they were actually learning. And so I think the challenge that we have is being clear in our values such that then our educators can express those to their students around what it is that we're trying to accomplish and what assessing and grading, what purpose that serves. And so, so that's just one little example is that nobody else was changing their practice, but in my classroom that was not an acceptable practice. But what's more important is my students needed to understand why, because if they didn't understand why, then that wasn't clear, going to be clear to them. So I think that's where we're coming back to policy is we have to be clear on our why or our values in order to drive that change.
And I'm going to offer this as well. I believe change is possible because in the not so distant past, teachers would look at their class list and say, well, a third of the students in this class can get this grade, a third of the students in the class can get this grade, and a third of the students need to fail for my class to be valid. And my guess is the four of you're not taking a class right now that at the end of the day, every student couldn't achieve an A. Like everybody has the opportunity to achieve an A in your classes right now. Well, that's not how it used to be. Like people had to fail to legitimize the class. And so as you think about that mindset, and the standards movement really said, it isn't about me competing against my neighbor, it's me competing against the set of standards and the expectations, and it really does allow for anyone to achieve that level of success. And what we're saying now is we think there's another turn of the wheel. We think there's an even better way. It isn't just that everybody can succeed. It's that everyone can succeed. Everyone can have a sense that they're cultivating in school. They're being successful in school. They enjoy school. They're demonstrating growth. Like these are all things that we truly believe all lead to better assessing, grading, and experiences for students. So now, how long did it take to go from, grading on the curve, needing people to fail, to current state? 30, 40 years. And if we never say there's a better way and let's take the next step to try and systematize that, then that 30 or 40 years passes and we're continuing to do what we're doing today and never making progress. So we can make progress, albeit slow, and Deputy Superintendent Gillingham kind of hit it on the head that it's really about this board and you as students, student reps to the board, identifying values that truly will drive really the next generation of assessing and grading in Lake Washington.
I'll add just one note, and then I see Director Yoakum. Oh, sorry. My hope comes from the interactions with teachers, students, and parents, educators over the past 5 years, that there actually has been tremendous change, and the difficulty of the times that we've lived through have accelerated that change. And I think it's been something that we're continuing to lean into, and I'm really excited about that. It took 35 years for some amounts of change, but it's taken 4 to 5 for some pretty dramatic steps already. So I have huge hope for us.
Suniri.
I just wanted to go back to the same slide that James was talking about, but a different bullet point. Yeah, I wanted to talk about the last bullet point where it's saying that we want to go from extrinsic motivation to intrinsic motivation. I'm assuming this means that instead of students being motivated by parents or teachers to get a grade or do well, we want students to be motivated for themselves. But what I've noticed is, in the world at large, not just in like Washington School District or whatever, is that no matter how much someone pushes you, if you really don't care about something, you're not going to be great at it. I think like rather than extrinsic to intrinsic motivation, we should change what we're motivating students to do. So what are students motivated for right now? It's to get that A grade. So maybe we should change that to from motivating students to get the grade to motivating students to learn. Because even if it is changing from extrinsic to intrinsic, if the students are still just trying to get that grade by any cost, it's not going to help them.
Thank you.
Director Yoka.
That was an excellent idea. I'm going to kind of go off of what was said before that. So we believe there's a better way and want to systemize that way, but do colleges hold the same values that maybe we do? And if we are a district that is, that a lot of students are college bound, does it really matter what our values are if they're not aligned with the colleges where students are looking to go?
So I think that there's probably a lot of answers or thoughts around that question. I'll share with you what was pretty powerful for me a couple years ago. When we were doing standards alignment in science, I ended up, for a variety of reasons, literally cold calling many colleges, specifically the chemistry departments at UW and the general admissions at UW, Western, Whitman, PLU, UPS, multiple colleges, and asking that question. My question to them was, what are the attributes of a successful first-year science student? And what they said back to me, essentially, and I talked to probably 15 different people, and they could have been in the same room saying the exact same thing to me. And they said, most students come into our schools and they can do like one set of equations. And if you say, okay, take the result of that equation and talk about, and apply it to another setting, that you've got maybe another 20% of kids can do that. Then when you start to ask questions or give a task like, okay, now apply that equation, that information to a new setting, then you're down to a much smaller percentage of students who can do that. And if you add the last question of, and say why it matters, a student who can do all of that is a very successful first-year student, and many students can't do that. So this work is really about, like, colleges are looking for those thinkers who can transfer knowledge, who can make sense of things, who can own their learning, who can figure things out. That's what colleges are looking for. I totally get the tension around grades. Absolutely. I know that you get a certain number of, you get a $2,000 scholarship if you have this GPA and you go to Western. Like, there's money attached, there's pressure attached to grades. I absolutely hear that. And to be successful in college, that's really what they're looking for, that depth and complexity of thinking, that ownership and that self-efficacy. It's not, there's a yes and, like, I didn't give you a full answer, I gave you a perspective.
So I think that we have a lot more questions and discussion, and so we're going to probably have to bring this back to another study session. We had a goal of trying to end early today so that we might take a little time to get to know all of our new student representatives, since they're all here, before we have to transition to our board meeting. But I did have one thing that I wanted to, you asked like what other questions or what else I need to know. From a policy perspective, I can appreciate that schools need autonomy and teachers need the ability to determine how they're going to run a classroom and grade their students. At the same time, I have questions about whether or not it makes sense that AP US History at one high school in our district versus AP US History at another high school in our district might be very different in terms of what students can expect, if they're at standard, if the grades are coming out very differently because teachers are running their classrooms very differently. I have questions about whether or not that makes sense, because then we're going to have families trying to pick schools based off of where they think grading makes sense for their students or their families. So I do have an interest in some sort of policy language, because I think that there needs to be some sort of similarity between our educational experience at our schools. Not saying that they need to be cookie cutter the same, but grades and what you should expect, I think there should be some sort of a standard. So it's not really a question, it is a question. We can talk about it more later, but I did want to wrap it up. I'm hearing that will be bringing this topic back at another study session. Yes, yes, yes. All right. With that being said, we will now adjourn the study session, the August 19th, 2024 study session at 6:36 p.m. And we're going to have some desserts, I think, over here so we can have some sweets and get to know our students. Thank you very much. It's in